we are going to start today by doing a little experiment. If you're down, maybe not an experiment, but at least audience participation. So, memory can be a tricky thing. How many of you remember exactly what you did last night? By show of hands. All right, good. I'm proud of you guys. That's pretty impressive. All right, what about last Tuesday at 6:15 p.m.? How many of you remember? All right, so slowly, it takes a little more, right? Okay. What about exactly 1 year ago on this date at this time? Oh, okay, one person, he's on top of his game. All right, so it's a little bit harder. Memory can be a tricky thing. Whether it's trying to recall an ordinary date in your past that all of a sudden has importance and new meaning, or maybe it's trying to recall why that certain phrase sounds so familiar. Or maybe even it's as simple as, wait, what was I about to do again? I know I came here for a reason, but I don't quite remember. We all have these experiences with memory. And around the world, humans put a lot of stock into remembering. We have museums, history classes, forms of art, all centered around our past. Even honestly, in our leisure time, when we sit around with loved ones, a huge majority of that time is recalling stories back and forth that have happened in your past. Maybe it's reliving great memories you have with your loved ones. Remember that time when? Something deeply wired in each of us yearns for memories, our own memories and other people's memories. Mixtapes, favorite meals, photo albums, they all have more substance than they first appear. They're all based on memories. Throughout Lamentations, we see the Israelites constantly remembering their past, constantly remembering their loss. They dwell on the greatness that used to be and the bleakness that they feel like is their reality now. And honestly, some of them may even believe that's their future. We're going to be looking in Lamentations 5 today. So if you've been with us since the beginning, this is the final week of Lamentations, and we are going to be in the last chapter of Lamentations. So that's chapter 5, and we're actually going to the last of chapter 5. So 19 through 22 is what we're going to be looking at. But you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations. Why have you forgotten us completely? Why have you forsaken us these many days? Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Maybe you're a scholar of laments. If so, in the Bible, the book of Lamentations is not the only lament. All throughout the book of Psalms, we see laments from David and other people. And in those laments, most of them have something in common. The lament is just temporary. It usually gives way to a thanksgiving. But here, we're at the last chapter, the last verses of this book, and it doesn't seem to have a trace of thanksgiving. There doesn't seem to be some big recognition. Instead, the people of Israel are crying out to God to please remember them, to restore them, to renew their days of old. It insinuates that perhaps remembering can bring forth restoration. The Israelites cry out saying, "Why, God, have you forgotten us completely?" Nobody wants to be forgotten. We have a human need to be seen, to be heard, to be acknowledged, to be remembered. When I graduated with my master's degree from Perkins at SMU, I attended graduation in May. And even though I really wasn't graduating until the end of the summer because I had one more class to take. So if you're following me, that year I was graduating in May, walking with everyone because that made sense to walk with my classmates. But I still had one more class to take. And you probably need some background to really get the full effect of this story. During my time in seminary, I was, let me think of the best way to say it, a wallflower? And if you know me, that may be not my typical style, but in seminary, I wouldn't sit at the front of the class, so I wasn't super overeager, but I wasn't at the back falling asleep either. I was right in the middle, and I never talked to the people around me. I never asked questions of the professor. I kind of just blended in. And during lunch, I wouldn't eat on campus in the kitchen there. I would go off campus to meet friends or go to some local place. And in Bridwell Library, the library right on campus, instead of studying upstairs in the colorful open concept rooms, I went down into the gray basement. I made friends here and there, but at graduation, I was the only one I knew who wasn't really graduating, who was just walking only to get my degree later. And as I stood in this room with all these people super excited, I started maybe second guessing that my name was going to be on the actual program. I got super concerned that because I wasn't really graduating until later, they had forgotten my name. So I called my family, who was already in the sanctuary, which is where the ceremony was going to be held. And when I called them, I said, "Hey, is my name on the program?" And it was kind of awkward and silent. And they said, "No, we can't find your name listed." And all of a sudden, in a room of bubbly, excited people about to get their degrees, I slammed my phone down, or hung it up, however that looks, but angry and worried. And I was riddled with anxiety. I didn't know what I had done wrong. I felt forgotten. I felt like I didn't matter. I felt like all my hard work had been for naught, that I was undeserving to be in that place. I felt forgotten. The Israelites sinned against God. And in return, they were conquered by Nebuchadnezzar, and their temple was destroyed. Their world probably seemed gray. They felt forgotten by God. The Israelites begged God in a final plea to move them from a place of pain and gray to a place of restoration. And in moments of pain, it often helps to recall our fond memories, to remind ourselves of happier times. And I want so badly for us on the last week of this book to look at the last chapter and the last verse and see a happy ending. Because I like happy endings. Happy endings aren't messy, they're pretty. It's what we've been kind of taught to expect. During my graduation fiasco, my family called back soon after, telling me my name was indeed listed. It was on another page in a whole nother section to be conferred in August. I got my happy ending. In the book of Lamentations, we don't get to hear happily ever after. Instead, we're left to imagine the next scene. And while I still can't wrap my head quite around how these people who just had their whole lives destroyed can write this beautiful acrostic poem in the midst of their suffering that we see in the book of Lamentations, I can imagine the scene at the end. Maybe the Israelites are gathering together right before dusk. They're sitting around a big fire. Maybe they have well-worn tear lines forming on each person's face. They probably have their phones on silent, which is how you know it's a serious moment. And I can imagine the first Israelite silently first, then softly saying, "Remember that time when..." Our memories aren't always happy and perfect. Maybe sometimes you'd rather forget something in your past than remember it. The loss that the Israelites felt was hard. It was impactful. It wasn't happy. It was lamentful. Yet, by remembering their enormous loss, they were able to seek God. They were able to look forward and ask God to move them past their pain, to look forward to restoration. Remembering can help us, especially in moments of pain and loss. On May 8th, 1866, in Waterloo, New York, a town continued what had become an annual ritual. They closed all their shops in town, people took off work, and they gathered together with flowers and flags to put on the graves of fallen soldiers. This was the first federally recognized Memorial Day. While some of us may take this weekend to celebrate an extra day off from work or school, it's intended to be a day of remembrance. In 2000, Congress passed legislation that all Americans on Memorial Day are encouraged to pause for a national moment of remembrance at 3 p.m. local time. A moment of remembrance. A time for us to honor those who have served our country. A time for us to come together in the face of death and recognize those people who have given their lives. A time for us to come together regardless of our political differences, religious divisions, or racial divides. As humans, we recognize the reality of death and the reality of war. Maybe you have special memories to recall of a loved soldier in your life. A couple of years ago, I attended a funeral, and the pastor's homily was centered around encouraging the congregation to tell stories of the deceased, to laugh, to cry, to celebrate the life that had left. Remember that time when. As we remember our past, we recognize the cyclical nature of life. It's crazy to think that the book of Lamentations, a book written in 586 BC, could still be relevant in 2016. The times are so different, but we still know what it feels like to be forgotten. We know what it feels like to want to remember our past, to yearn for restoration. I love that the Israelites cry out to God saying, "Why, God, have you forsaken us?" I don't love it. I don't revel in their misery. That's not why I love it. I love it because I can't read that passage without making a parallel to the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I love it because it reminds me that without remembering one another, we're lost. And that restoration can not necessarily take away our pain and make everything better, but that God offers us restoration through Jesus. That Jesus reminds us that we are beautiful, beloved children, that we are truly desired, that we are destined to bring God's kingdom here to earth. Restoration is offered to each of us. We are called to follow Christ's example. We are followed to love each other, to love our neighbors, to remember our past, to remember the forgotten. We're called to embody a servant's heart. This book, written in 586 BC, is still relevant today because we recognize what the Israelites are saying in chapter 19, verse 19. They say this: "But you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations." There's beauty in the consistency of a God that reigns forever. There's something to be said from learning about our past mistakes. The Israelites throughout the Old Testament struggle with following God. One day they're, woohoo, God, we love you. Another day they're like, here's a golden calf. I'm going to worship it. And I'm going to worship this other God. See you later, real God. And then they have to ask for forgiveness. And every time, God grants them forgiveness. And the cycle begins again. They're right back here, praising God, and they mess up again. And it starts over and over and over again. And that's how we are, right? I make a mistake, and I have to ask God for forgiveness. And oftentimes, I make that mistake again in a different situation. But every time, God grants restoration. The Israelites, maybe they weren't the ones who have received that forgiveness. Maybe for some of them in Lamentations, they've just heard stories of God's forgiveness. They've just heard that, oh man, God is great. He forgives and restores. But maybe they're a little skeptical about it. Who is a God that loves us this much to forgive us and forgive us and forgive us? Remembering our losses and remembering God's love are really hard to do at the same time. Because in pain, it's oftentimes hard to look for the hope. Yet, God's love reigns forever. God reigns forever. Jesus lived his life as a fully human being to show us that God understands what it means to be human. We must look to our past, to our memories, to remember, to find true restoration. We must also remember that maybe some things in the past happened to teach us how to be better, how to do better, how to expect better. When we see the pain of the Holocaust, deaths of war, hatred of slavery, destruction brought on by natural disasters, what do we glean from those? Do we just shrug our shoulders and say, let's just forget about all that and maybe it won't happen again? Or do we speak up? Do we speak up for those who maybe injustice is being thrust upon? How do we use our past to influence a better world, to show glimpses of God's kingdom here on earth, to show what Jesus did when Jesus came to earth, to show love to one another? How can we remember and act on those remembrances, those past memories? How can we continue to fight for those who have gone before us? Sometimes a cycle needs to be broken, and we need to move forward in a new direction, not disregarding our past, but being restored and empowered by our past and renewed to a new day, to change. We are called to not forget those who have gone on before us or the history that they've left behind, but we are called to remember their stories, to remember our stories, to remember the histories, and to move forward with the love of God towards restoration. Remember that time when